Well, I'll do my little introduction.
Okay, sounds good.
So welcome to everybody who is currently on the call. This is the first Center Talks foray into online webinars, and Tara Perot has been very kind to be our guinea pig and help us work through this process for the very first time. So I've already had someone who's curious about who's on the call. If on the bottom of your screen, you should have a participants icon. If you click on that, you should be able to see who's involved. And if not, if you click on the chat, there's an option there to chat either to everyone or to an individual person who's on the call. So you should be able to do that as well. We are recording this webinar for your information, and we'll be sharing it with people who registered and couldn't attend, and in other ways. There's a question and answer button on the bottom right-hand side of your screen as well. So if you have a question, it would be great if you could type it in there, and we'll deal with those questions at the end. So if Tara's in the middle of something that you have a question you want to ask, type away, and we'll make sure we get there at the end of the
sorry, not to interrupt you, Lynn. Somebody asked me how I pronounce my first name. Actually, I do pronounce it Tara, not Tara. No, that's fine. I used to be so good at correcting people when I was young. I just become complacent, but yeah, it is Tara. Thank you for asking.
All right, thanks, Ray. I apologize for that.
It's fine. I don't do a very good job.
All right. So now, without any further ado, I will introduce Tara and tell you a little bit about her. So Tara is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dalhousie. She received her PhD in neuroscience from Western University in London, and then went on to complete her postdoctoral training at the University of Maryland School of Medicine before joining DAL in 2002. So she studied the stress response and factors that influence its development and expression for most of her research career. Very timely topic, I would say, these days. Lately, she's incorporated her personal passions for healthy living into her research. Presently, she and her graduate students are involved in studies on the interaction of diet and stress and the effects of exercise and mindfulness on brain and stress-related outcomes. The top of the list of her many enjoyments in life are hiking, gardening, cooking, and yoga. And she's lucky, almost, I would say all of those are possible in the middle of a pandemic. So.
That's right. I'm very fortunate.
Awesome.
All right.
All right. I'm going to let Tara take over, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. When I agreed, this was not what I had envisioned. This is my first webinar, I have to say, being the person at the front. So I really hope that I come across as engaging as I normally am in person. I can only hope, but I hope that more than anything that you find there's something informative in what I'm going to tell you about today. So I just want to start by acknowledging that the Mahone Bay Center, who is graciously hosting this webinar, sits in Mushumush, the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So achieving lifelong brain health. So, oh, sorry, I'll get to here. Okay, so I mean, this begs the question, what is a healthy brain? And we could spend many, many hours talking about that at the various levels at which it's been studied. For our purposes, and which is really a broad and overarching basic introduction really into a healthy brain. We're going to use a definition that I've got on the slide. So a healthy brain supports those processes that go on up there that are needed for you to do what you do every day. And we all want to preserve that functioning for as long as we possibly can. So the topics that I'll cover today, because this is meant to be a talk for anyone and everyone, I will presume you know nothing other than the fact that the brain is inside your skull, and I will give you some basics about the brain. And then I'm going to talk quite extensively about the brain and the fact that it doesn't live in isolation. So brain-body connections. And then I'll end with talking about the experienced brain, and some of the risks that exist for losing the cognitive faculties and losing the health of the brain, and by talking about some strategies for reducing those risks. So if you were to take your brain out and hold it in your hands, it would sit there like this big mushy thing. It would only weigh about 3 pounds. So imagine this, all that it does, everything you do, all the thoughts you have, the emotions you have, the movements you make, come from this weighs less than your liver mass of almost, so it's sort of jelly-like when it's not in any fixed state. But it's extremely complicated, and we're not going to go into all its complexities today, but I think I'll give you a good sense of some of the basics of its functioning. So the outer surface, what you can see on the slide, and I'm used to interacting with my slides, and I apologize, I'm not quite sure how to do that, but you can see it right there. The outer surface is called the cortex, and you've probably heard that. And you can see that it's got all these foldings in it. And it's folded like this for an excellent reason, and that is to pack more cells into less space. So you can imagine in all these folds, these involutions, you've got cells and connections. So if it was just smooth, you wouldn't be able to pack as much in as you can when it's folded like that. So this is really a very basic overview, but one that we use as neuroscientists to delineate the major parts of the outer surface, the cortex. So you've got the front part, the frontal lobe, you've got a side part here, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe in the back, and the temporal lobe kind of sits over top of your ear. And obviously you've got that on both sides of your head. So we'll go a little more into detail about the function, very basic, but the basic functions of each of those parts of the cortex. So I've labeled this front and back because sometimes it's difficult to envision that when you're not used to it. And like I said, I can't easily interact with my slides. But just a few things to point out. Vision is in actually the occipital lobe, or the back of your brain. So you get information coming in through the eyes, it gets processed along the way, and it ends up in the back of the cortex. So it's very dangerous, to have an impact to the back of your head. People will often lose sight for periods of time. And then you've got other parts of the brain that are important for different functions. Memory in the temporal lobe. Some of the more basic things that your brain's involved in, like your heart rate, your breathing, are in the brainstem. So very, very low down. So for instance, you could lop off, theoretically, the front of your brain, and there have been horrible accidents where this has occurred, and people survive because they're the real core parts of the brain that keep you alive are maintained. They certainly aren't the same person after such an accident, but it's they're not the most important parts in terms of survival. But the front part of the brain is one of the most important parts for humans because it's involved in these very, very high level, what we call sort of executive functions of the brain, our ability to attend. So right now you're attending, you might be in the background making some sort of decision that you had to make from earlier, planning dinner. All those types of higher order functions are in the very front part of the brain. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we go along. So what's really interesting to think about differences between us and other animal species. So humans and other primates are distinguished in terms of our brains, well, in a number of ways, but one is that we have more of this folding in the cortex. So the animal species that I have worked a lot with over the years in my research is a rat. So you can see the rat brain there on the slide. It's smooth. So there's no involutions, there's no folding. It's just a smooth cortex. And so the complexity of it is much less than it is in humans and other primates. So that's a really big difference between us and other species, and obviously speaks to the evolutionary processes that have occurred over, millions of years. And also, we have larger frontal cortical regions. So I just told you that those regions are important for executive functions. Now, it's not that a rat doesn't attend to things, or even a cat, let's say, that has some, complexity to the cortex and certainly some frontal region, but not as much as us. And it's not that they can't, make decisions, but not to the same extent that we have that ability. We can decide to do things, we can make a 10-year plan if we want and follow through the steps. And so those are really very complex, almost exclusively primate functions of the cortex. So it's not just a cortex, even though that's what, obviously you see if you ever watch a movie and they've got the brain exposed. It's, you're looking at the cortex. It's the most identifiable spot or area of the brain for most people. But there are some, I would say, extremely important structures below the cortex that we call subcortical structures. And they communicate with one another, and they communicate with the cortex. So it's this whole, works together, obviously. So I'm not going to go into great detail here, and there'll be no test at the end. You don't have to remember these terms, but just to give you a sense. So I talked before about some of the really basic functions of the brain: heart rate, breathing. Obviously, in all species, so the rat as well has those basic functions in the same spot as we do in the brainstem. You can dissect out a human brain and a rat brain, and you'll find very, very similar functions. So those the lower the function, the more similarity there is across species. And even some of the regions like the amygdala, it's involved in emotion processing, fear, very similar across species. The hypothalamus is involved in a lot of the communication between the body and the brain with respect to hormone release. So the ovaries and testes produce gonadal hormones like testosterone and estrogen, but this is in response to a previous hormone release by the hypothalamus that went into the bloodstream and told the organs to produce those hormones. So extremely important regions, obviously. And if people have hormone imbalances, they often originate in the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland, and you might have heard of the pituitary gland before. Hippocampus, very important for memory. There's some classic studies where there was part of the hippocampus taken out, usually for epileptic seizures to relieve the seizure, but then, leaving the person with no ability to form new memories. So these are all really important parts of the brain. And as I said, they're much more similar between us and other species than the cortex, especially, excuse me, the frontal cortex. And here we've got sort of highlighted the prefrontal cortex, which is even sort of that nitty-gritty part that really distinguishes us from other species because of its role in higher executive type functions. So we've gone from the cortex, the outside of the brain, to the subcortical structures, and I just want to end by giving you a sense of how the communication actually happens between these structures. These are, large, but they're obviously made up of tiny cells, like the rest of your body. Your skin's made of skin cells, your liver of liver cells. Well, your brain is made of specialized cells called neurons. And there's billions of connections between neurons. And they basically are what is enabling me to stand here and remember what I want to say and talk to you and make the sound come out and you to hear it and comprehend, hopefully, and hopefully also remember. So the neurons are very important. So I just want to take you through a basic neuron structure. Okay, this is like back to first year. So like any cell in your body, well, there's a cell body, a nucleus, but the neuron, because it has to talk to other neurons, it's got two, well, I suppose three, but especially two special parts of it. So it's got the dendrites on the cell body, and then it's got this axon with these terminals at the end. And so the connections between the terminals of one neuron and the dendrites of another is how the neurons communicate with one another. And not to get too into it, but it's an electrochemical communication. There is an actual electrical signal in the first neuron that travels down the axon, and it causes the release of chemicals into the space between these terminals on the one neuron and the dendrites on the other. So you probably heard the term neurotransmitter, and this is exactly what it is. It's the chemicals that are released that basically, float, let's say, between the synaptic terminals of one neuron and the dendrites of the other, and telling that next neuron what to do. And so you've probably heard of some of the common neurotransmitters. Dopamine is it's often called the feel-good neurotransmitter. It's released in response to feeding, in response to having sex, and things like that. Very motivated behaviors. You've probably heard of serotonin. So we know that a number of the drugs we use for depression work on the serotonin system. We don't know exactly how they relieve the depression, but they do by increasing levels of serotonin. We'll talk about serotonin again. So I bring up neurotransmitters just so you have an idea of what they do, because they're extremely important, obviously, and there's something that can be preserved in the experienced brain, as long as there's not structural damage to the neurons. There might be functional changes, lower levels of neurotransmitter released, for instance, but those things are somewhat modifiable. And that's what we're looking for: prevention and potentially remediation when there start to be, age-related cognitive problems. So just to put it all together, you've got this thing in your head that has the ability to pick up your environment, whether you're touching something, you're tasting something, you're seeing something, hearing something, whatever. There's parts of the brain, obviously, that are attuned to that. That information gets rapidly processed. It might cause an emotional response. If I saw a tiger coming in right now, or even heard one, I'd probably have quite an emotional response. I'd have some stress hormone release, all sorts of things would happen. So there's this integration between the cortex and these subcortical structures. You're going to form memories, or maybe bring up a memory of something as you're processing information. You might have some attending to do and some planning, and then you might have to engage in a physical movement at the end of it. And the brain does all of that. And as you know, it does it quickly. It does it, without us standing here and pondering it and wondering how it happens. And that's, we want to preserve that as much as possible. All of those parts of it as we go through life. So the brain does not exist in isolation of the other organs of the body. And I think it's getting better. We still talk about physical health and mental health, and I think there's reason to do that under certain circumstances. And I understand where it comes from, but I think sometimes it's too separate. It makes us think that mental health exists without physical health, and vice versa. And, I'd really like to put it out there that is not the case. There's not many mental disorders, depression I'll use as an example again, that don't have some effect that we might think of, below the head at other parts of the body. So it's really difficult to separate that out. And that's really what I want to drive home today. And I'm going to give you a little bit of, I guess, examples from the scientific literature, not just to support that. So the brain-heart connection. The brain, as I said, weighs about 3 pounds, a little bit less maybe than your liver on average, but it requires 1/5 of the body's oxygen supply. It's a hog, okay? So even at rest, it's using a lot of oxygen, a lot of glucose, and the heart is what supplies that. So you can imagine that if your heart is not functioning optimally, then you're not getting, obviously, enough or optimal amounts of blood and oxygen via the blood to support the processes going on in this organ that uses so much oxygen. So healthy neurons need a healthy heart. You all know that if the heart stops, you've got a very limited amount of time to step in to ensure that neurons, the brain doesn't start to die. And you can have some cell death in the brain without a lot of functional changes, but not too much. And the brain, unfortunately, is one of the few parts of the body that does not regenerate its neurons. Now, that there's a couple of spots in the brain that do produce new neurons across the lifespan, but for the most part, if a cell dies in the brain, it's gone forever. It does not regenerate. Your skin cells, I don't know if they regenerate, liver cells, but not the brain. So it's really important to try to keep it as healthy as possible. And it needs a good, strong heart to provide the blood and the oxygen. And the other point to connect the brain and the heart is that cardiovascular disease is a major risk factor for dementia. So it's really important to try to keep the heart as healthy as possible going throughout life. So you may have, this has been a kind of a hot topic, I think, in the general news over the last few years, and that's the connection between the brain and the gut. And this is something that in my lab we've started to become interested in. I have 2 PhD students now who are working in this area, and we have a contract with a company in Montreal that produces probiotics, and we've been doing some work to see if probiotics can alter the stress response, for instance. And so the gut and the brain communicate directly and indirectly. Okay, so I'll show you another slide in a second. And the population of bacteria in your gut has a direct impact on various aspects of brain functioning. And it seems like every day there's new articles to back that up. So there's a direct connection between we have 12 cranial nerves down here in the brainstem. And one of those, the vagus nerve, there's a direct connection from cells, specialized cells in your gut to your brain. So, I mean, we all know this. So imagine if the tiger did show up at the door right now. I mean, one of the first things would happen was my gut would be like, everyone knows that feeling, when things happen that are not, that are aversive. One of the first things you do is get that horrible feeling in your stomach. Well, that's the direct connection between the brain and the vagus nerve. And the gut via the vagus nerve. But there's also a lot of indirect communication between the two. There's hormones that have, so hormones act by basically what we call, they act on receptors. It's just a spot for them to sit and then things happen. And so there's receptors in the brain and the gut for the same hormones. So the hormones act here, they go down, they act here. There's also neurotransmitters. Serotonin, for instance, is actually produced in the gut. And serotonin, as I just said, is obviously a neurotransmitter in the brain and is involved in diseases, disorders like depression. And so we're starting to get a better sense of how important it is that the gut is in good health with respect to brain functioning, mood, things like that, and the immune system as well. So I'm not an immunologist and I'm not an expert with the immune system, but I know that there are aspects of the immune system, cytokines and things that are released when you have an infection, when you've been exposed to a virus or bacteria, that can act both in the gut and in the brain. The brain's very sensitive to, has quite a very strong immune response. So this kind of just summarizes, I guess, what I've said. So the gut, you've probably heard the term microbiome. And all it does is refer to the population of microbes, so viruses, bacteria, some other types of things that exist. And there's microbiomes throughout your body. So your mouth, big microbiome. So if you were to sequence all the stuff in there, like genetically sequence it, you'd have a ton of viruses, bacteria, and all these different things. Same with your gut, same with your skin. There's a vaginal one as well. So all of these can be interrupted. Well, think of the example of if you take antibiotics, women know that you often end up with a yeast infection because you're messing up the normal population of microbes everywhere in your body. So the gut has a very well studied at this point, not as well as it needs to be, but it's still well studied microbiome. And there's a whole bunch of things you can do to change that. But there's these, connections, like I said before, between the gut and the brain. And, things like stress and anxiety, mood, and other types of behaviors have been studied with respect to this gut-brain axis, with the brain affecting all sorts of things in the gut. Motility, so how fast food moves through, secretion of the enzymes needed to break down the food, nutrients from the food getting into the bloodstream. The brain has connection or has influence over all of those things that, we kind of think of as being the domain of the gut. But there's really, there's more and more work showing this really intimate connection between the two. And just to give you an idea of what kinds of things alter the gut microbiota. As I said, antibiotics. When you take an antibiotic for a specific infection, the doctors decided you have a bacterial infection and given you antibiotics. The antibiotics destroy all bacteria. Okay, so there's mostly good, beneficial bacteria in your gut. They're there to kind of counter the potentially harmful ones and do these other good things, in terms of mood and so on. But antibiotics will, destroy all of that. So it's always, obviously, as we all know, we should be taking them very, very prudently. Lifestyle can affect the microbiome, diet, obviously, and some aspects of hygiene. And then we've got this connection between the immune system and the microbiome as well. So the brain, as I said before, is sensitive to activation of the immune system. And there's this two-way communication. And the reason that I bring up the immune system, even though I'm not, like I said, not an expert at all, is because of this aspect of inflammation. And I'll come back to that. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that activation of the immune system can lead to sort of systemic inflammation, which can have really bad effects on the brain and lead to faster deterioration of cognition as we age. So let's get into the experienced brain, as I like to call it. So normal aging is not dementia. I'm not going to, I can answer some questions about, dementia. I'm certainly not a gerontologist, and I don't really study, aging at all. But that's not the point I want to get across here. Is that there are changes in the brain with normal aging, and those can affect your cognitive processes. And there's ways to modify those, and there's preventative things that we can do. So that's really what I'm getting at, is trying to keep your brain as healthy as you can and sort of slow the normal aging process, which will hopefully slow the onset of dementia. I mean, some people will end up with dementia, but we're trying to to prevent that. So normal aging, what's been found, and these are just some basic facts. Generally, as people get older, there's poorer performance on tasks of attention and memory. But there's also better performance on some tasks that involve problem solving and judgment. People tend to, as they get older, have better judgment. I think we can all appreciate that. And maybe just have more experience, which would obviously come in handy when you're solving problems and so on. And the important thing too is so sorry, but I'll just contrast that with dementia and Alzheimer's. So in dementia, and there's a number of forms of dementia, with Alzheimer's being one form, probably the most common severe form. The cognitive deficits that occur, they interfere with daily social and occupational functioning. So, with normal aging, I mean, maybe you need to write yourself a few more little notes here and there. I certainly need to remind myself of things in a different way than I used to. But that's distinguished from the kind of deterioration in function that happens with dementia and Alzheimer's. So that's important. But what I want to kind of focus on are the differences at the level of the brain and the neurons. So with normal aging, there's no structural changes to the neurons. They're not structurally different, they're functionally different. So like I said before, there might be a change in neurotransmitter release or something along those lines, which potentially it could be remediated, if you can get the levels up, or you can do things that will enhance the function. But with dementia and Alzheimer's, there's real structural changes to the neurons. With Alzheimer's, there's classic, it's really diagnosed at autopsy when the brain is taken out and it's looked at in very thin sections. You can see these tangles. You've probably heard about this stuff, but tangles of neurons and plaques of amyloid, and these things, they prevent neurons from actually communicating in a structural sense. So that is really not what we're talking about here. We're trying to maintain normal aging. Maintain the brain throughout the normal aging process. So the risk factors that have been shown to be associated with cognitive decline and potentially going on to dementia, biggest risk factor. And unfortunately, it's not modifiable. But the good news is that a number of the others are. Hypertension or high blood pressure is probably, when you look at the risk factors in terms of how much they really do contribute to to cognitive decline, hypertension is probably at the top of the list. Obesity and diabetes, anything that affects the metabolism, the insulin, the brain is very sensitive to that. So those are major risk factors. Smoking. Depression has also been shown to be a risk factor. Social isolation. So, I mean, obviously, there's people out there that live their whole lives, living alone, but we're not really talking about that. We're talking about the feeling of social isolation, of actually not being engaged with others as much as one would like. And hearing loss. And I want to put a plug in for this one. I noticed a real deterioration in my hearing a few years ago, and finally last year, at the ripe age of 49, I decided to have it checked, and I'd lost about 50% of my high frequency hearing. So I got hearing aids, and it's just been It's been amazing. So they're not cheap. They're not covered by many plans either. But I really would encourage everybody to get your hearing checked. It's the risk with hearing loss is quite high. They're not quite sure why, not quite sure the mechanism, but it certainly is something to keep in mind. It is something that obviously can be treated, and hopefully that will take away the risk or reduce the risk for the cognitive decline due to that. So a lot of the risk factors that I've mentioned have sort of common mechanisms in the brain. A lot of them lead to systemic inflammation, vascular, so this is blood vessels, and neuron cells damage, and changes in brain blood flow. So those seem to be kind of at the root of a lot of these, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them. So if we can take care of those things, if we can modify those things, keep those processes from happening, then we're more likely to be able to modify those risk factors and keep our cognition intact. So that's my little slide of the heart plus the brain plus the gut. Got to maintain the health of those three parts of our body. So what basic things can we do to preserve cognition? Well, of course, and by this point, we should all know there's no magic pill for anything. And it's certainly the case for maintaining our brain health. And I hope at this point you appreciate that I believe a healthy body equals a healthy brain. So prevention is really the key. Of the risk factors, there's multiple modifiable lifestyle factors that feed into those risk factors that we can focus on. And I want to point out too, before I go through things, that there'll be people out there that are doing all of the things that I'm going to talk about, and there'll be people that are doing maybe none of the things, and that's all okay. And it's just it's never too late to start to make some healthy changes. There's no doubt about that. And that's been shown in the literature as well. You don't have to start these things, you can start them at any point and they have benefits. So eating a healthy diet. I'm going to sound like your mom now. Here it comes. So a high-fat diet, there's tons of research now showing it to be associated with various brain-related outcomes, reduced attention, reduced mood, even some memory type of processes. There's a number, you probably hear in the general news of different diets, the keto diet. I'm not going to go into, I'm not a dietitian. This is more for me, I'm starting to get into this in my own research, but it's still, I'm still, learning about it. And it's not my goal to go through all the different diets, but the one diet that comes across in a number of studies is a Mediterranean diet, or a Mediterranean-like diet. And it has been linked to better cognitive performance. It has been shown to have anti-inflammatory effects. So again, reducing inflammation in the body, which reduces it in the brain, healthy for your heart, healthy brain. I'll also make a plug for probiotic supplementation. I'm not going to go out on a limb here. I think we're still learning about whether taking probiotics really has a lot of benefits. Our microbiomes are very individual. Mine's different from yours, different from somebody else who's listening. So it's difficult to know whether these mass-produced probiotics are really, having beneficial effects. There's certainly some studies that show small effects. So if you can afford them, they're not always cheap, then certainly it might be something to consider. So the Mediterranean diet looks something like this. High consumption of grains and legumes, good fats, so fats that are not saturated, olive oil, avocado, handful of nuts for a snack, salmon with the omega-3 fatty acids, lots of fruits and veggies, and a low consumption of high quality animal protein. And I just want to contrast this with our latest Canada Food Guide, which I believe is definitely an improvement over the pyramid that we had for many years. And there's a lot of similarities between this and this. I do just want to point out that I think with the Mediterranean, there's more of a focus on getting your protein, which is very important, from the grains and the legumes, from more plant-based sources as opposed to animal-based sources. And I'm not a vegetarian. I'm not plugging vegetarianism or veganism or anything, but I do think that limiting the animal protein is not a bad thing to do. But certainly our food guide, is starting to look a little closer to this, and I hope that people are paying attention to that. And just to, to sort of pick at a few of these things. Again, I'm not a dietitian, but obviously whole grain foods, the fiber you get from the vegetables and the grains, we know is good for the gut. Protein is really important to keep up with, especially as we get older. Muscle mass starts to be lost, and there's nothing worse than, losing the muscle mass. It leads to so many other issues with respect to potential falls and things like that. So really important, I think, to keep that in mind and make sure you get enough protein. And if you prefer animal protein, well, whatever, but get the protein, because I think it's very important. So engage in physical activity. I live in this wonderful Martins River neighborhood. I'm sure there's some of you out in the audience, and there's a lot of active people out here, and it's just wonderful. And we've known for many years about the benefits of physical activity for the brain. There's studies showing that for depression, engaging in regular, moderate exercises is good as giving a antidepressant for mild depression. And we can see the same changes in the brain with those. So physical activity leads to the release of certain hormones that are good for the brain. It reduces stress hormones, which are very bad for the brain. That's a whole other talk if you're happy for me to come back. And it promotes the release of other things that support neurons staying healthy. So we've known that for a long time. Again, these are things that people need to engage in and make decisions about behavior change, which is not always easy if you've been sedentary. But anything you can do is going to be better than doing nothing. And walking is a great exercise. You don't have to be running marathons, walking, anything that gets the heart rate up a bit. And also, I would put a plug out there for strength training, resistance training, something like that, to keep the muscle mass, maintain the flexibility, and anything that maybe helps with balance as well. I think as we get older, there's just a lot of changes that together kind of can lead to things like falling and so on. But all these things are certainly great for the body, which is great for the brain. And and the best place to do your exercise is outside. So this is a separate issue, but taken together, it's even better. So I gave up the gym a number of years ago in favor of trying to do more things that involve where I prefer to be, which is outside, not inside. So there's studies that have actually looked at nature exposure, and especially with respect to stress, which I know best. So stress hormone release is reduced with nature exposure. And stress hormones, again, as I said, are not good for the brain. Green exposure can improve attention. And when exercise is done in nature, compared to the same exercise, not in nature, it actually has added benefits. I think that, and gardening, a big plug for gardening. I know, gardening is not everybody's favorite activity, but anyway, I put that in there just as a personal thing. But anything you can do outside. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention yoga and meditation. And I've looked into this literature, I guess, more from my own personal interest, although I'm starting to try to bring some of these things into my research. There's a lot of evidence for yoga improving some of the cognitive processes that I was talking about before, attention, decision-making, things like that, in addition to having effects that are supportive of the brain, like reducing cardiovascular disease risk and reducing inflammation. It also reduces stress, which is really the reason I ever went into yoga, but it has these additional benefits of increasing strength and flexibility. And I know that, if you've never done any yoga or you've never done any meditation, it might be a bit daunting. And it doesn't have to be. If you go on, if you're interested in any kind of meditation, I mean, both of them really still the mind. That's the whole point. Yoga is really a moving meditation. You're keeping your focus on your breath and body, and you're not letting that crazy mind go, as it often likes to do. So that's the purpose, and it's very, very beneficial. But there's videos on YouTube for, simple meditation practices and for yoga as well. And I do want to say that, yoga doesn't need to be, I don't know if you have these visions in your head of people holding these amazing poses, and, that is certainly not accessible for everybody, but yoga can be accessible for everybody and anybody. So I, up until recently, was teaching a chair yoga class at Northwood, and it's anybody can benefit from yoga, and there's a lot of poses that can be done from a chair if you can't get down to the ground, and obviously meditation and breathing exercises can be done in the chair, and they can be done by anyone and anywhere. So I'd encourage you to, you can reach out to me. I can probably provide some more information and links and things like that, but one day I might even offer some yoga classes here in Martins River when I have more time. But anyway, stay tuned for that. That's not going to be quite yet. Another thing, as I said before, that one of the risk factors for cognitive decline is social isolation. So, be social. For some people, it's so easy, right? But for others, it's not as easy. If it doesn't come naturally, it's something they have to really, seek out and think about and actively, do. So our brains, we as humans are evolved for social interaction. And that's, I think, why, the last few months have been extremely challenging for a lot of people. That's who we are as a species. And so there was a study a number of years ago that showed that loneliness has been found to exert negative health effects similar to a lifetime of smoking. So you've got increased morbidity and mortality, all those things that, are just are bad. And, potentially this is modifiable. Yeah. So yeah, exercise, share healthy meals with others when we're all able to do so again. I know we're all getting just chomping at the bit. I know I am anyway. Okay, so be curious. So when I was putting this talk together a couple of years ago for the St. Margaret's Bay Seniors Association, a similar talk series, I just came across, it wasn't something I'd really thought about, but it turns out that as we get older, we become less curious. And, it kind of makes sense, right? You know what you like, and you got your routines, and, you know, and I think it goes along with taking less risks, which is probably smart to some extent. But, you know, what we're trying to do is build resilience in the brain. We're trying to build a cognitive resilience so that if we do lose some of those processes, we've got enough that we can keep going in our everyday functioning. And kids, you know, are the greatest example of having a ton of reserve, cognitive reserve. And kids are the most curious of all. So, you know, if we can kind of start engaging in some of these behaviors that, you know, take us back, maybe, you know, get the brain thinking it's in a younger state, it's great. It's definitely going to be beneficial. So it's been shown that being curious releases neurotransmitters involved in learning and memory and anti-inflammation, which is, as you should know by now, is a good thing, and enhances those brain regions involved in learning and memory. So, you know, try something new. I mean, even if you're doing a lot of the things I've been talking about, well, maybe it's time to, you know, mix it up and try something different. Be creative. So there's a lot of work been done looking at usually higher level people that, you know, have become high level musicians or artists and things like that. And those people often have a lot of cognitive reserve. They tend to go off, you know, into advanced age, maintaining their cognitive processes. And again, it's never too late to start. The brain, you know, it's most plastic early on, but it maintains plasticity, you know, throughout life. So it will receive if you choose to throw something new at it. And obviously, you know, new skills are not accessible for everyone, not every skill, but I think that, you know, there's something out there for everybody in terms of enhancing your creative side. So I will finish. So basically modify what you can in your life to build up that cognitive reserve, reduce the risk of dementia. Obviously, if you start anything new that involves physical activity, I will tell you to consult your physician. If you feel that your diet could be better, consult a dietitian or nutritionist. Many of the supermarkets now have dietitians, nutritionists on staff. I know the superstore in Tantallon, the dietitian there is, we've worked together before. She's a great woman, Edie, and she'd be happy to chat. I don't know about Bridgewater. I just haven't, I haven't seen anybody there. I'm sure they probably have somebody, but set achievable goals. If you're starting, you know, if you don't do any of these things and you feel like you want to start, great. But, you know, don't say, oh, I'm going to walk 5 miles tomorrow, from never having walked a mile. You know, it's little steps. Definitely, it's little steps anytime we start something new. Join a group, see friends from a distance for now. Definitely get outside, take a lesson, teach yourself something new. This can be done online too. It doesn't have to be in person, obviously. There's tons of YouTube videos out there for doing everything and anything. But really, you got to keep living life, I think, is the take-home message. But you need to live it well, you know. So you need to incorporate some of these things, and you will build up that cognitive reserve and preserve your everyday functioning for many years to come. I will take some questions if there are any.
Well, actually, we do have a couple. So the first one is from Penny Carver, and it is,
Hi, Penny. I miss you, Penny.
What is the mechanism by which depression and social isolation affect neuron structure and
Efficacy by which depression and socialization
affect neuron structure and efficacy?
Wow, that's quite the question, Penny. Yeah, good question. Well, let's see. Well, I mean, I think, you know, well, certainly, I don't know as much about the mechanisms underlying social isolation. I mean, I know it's a big risk factor from studies that have been done looking at risk factors. Depression, I guess I can speak to a little bit more. I mean, depression's associated with chronic depressions associated with a number of changes in the brain. So the hippocampus I mentioned as it's not only involved in memory, but it's also a big receiver of stress hormones. So they act there. And stress is often a factor involved in the development of depression. So there's a lot of sort of links between those two. And there's been studies, imaging the brains of depressed people. And they have smaller hippocampus, for instance, than non-depressed. Now, these are correlational studies you have to keep in mind. But we know when we do these things, when we look at animal studies, and animal studies are difficult because we can't really say a rat's depressed. So there's that challenge. But there are definitely changes associated with chronic stress, which often leads to depression. And these include shrinkage of those dendrites that I showed you. So imagine if you got smaller dendrites or fewer of them, that's going to interfere with communication between neurons and interfere potentially with the release of the serotonin, which supports healthy mood and so on. And that contributes to that shrinkage of brain regions like the hippocampus. So there's a number of changes, and the longer someone's depressed for, the more changes generally are seen, or the more detriment to the brain is seen. So I'll leave it at that. But there's certainly a lot of structural changes. Yeah.
Okay, so Penny has another question, but just before we get to that one, Janet Joyce wants to know what some examples of probiotics you might recommend are.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a local one. I don't know. I mean, so probiotics there's many examples of probiotics. I mean, a lot of anything cultured, right, has a lot of cultured things have active bacterial content, and that's really what we're talking about. So there's yogurts that have active biological bacterial components, so that's going to act as a probiotic. But there's also probiotics that are, I guess, produced, with just a couple of species of bacteria in them, and these species usually they're ones that have been shown to be beneficial for the gut. Lactobacillus is one of them. So there's a company in Nova Scotia that makes the cultured coconut, and they use coconut water and kefir, which is the cultured product, and they have done the tests to figure out how much of the health promoting bacteria are contained in their product. So it is a high enough amount to actually, make a difference. So I've been buying that for the last few years. You take, it's like a liquid. So you take like a tablespoon of it a day. So, I mean, it's almost $20 for, I don't know how big eat a lot. But like I said, anything. I mean, eating kimchi, anything that's been cultured, is fermented, is going to have some probiotic properties, some active bacteria in there that are health promoting. So I know there's you can go to the library too and look up some books on fermenting and things like that, and I'll give you some examples if you want to go with a more, if you want to make something at home that might have probiotic properties. But if you're going to purchase something, I like the cultured coconut. Put a plug in for them. Anything locals always preferred.
Great. Okay. Next question is again from Penny. Loneliness versus being alone. So are the negative effects of feeling lonely the same as effects of being alone?
No, and actually I meant to say that earlier, that they are, that being alone and loneliness are definitely not equivalent. I mean, there are people that live alone their whole lives and they're perfectly happy. Um, you know, I, we all vary in the amount of time we like to spend alone. No, loneliness is really a lack of social engagement, to the point, like when you want social engagement. So you would like it, but it's just not there. So it's that feeling of isolation, I think, is really maybe a better way to state it. So yes, definitely being alone and loneliness are two different things, and the detrimental effects, I don't think, I think that in some of the studies they've done on loneliness, the control subjects are people that are alone but don't report being lonely. So it's really being lonely. It's not being alone that is the risk factor. And again, the mechanism for that, just like the mechanism for the hearing loss, some of these things they've been identified, but the mechanisms are still being worked out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, and finally, well, maybe not finally, the last one I have right now is, does the brain ever fully recover from a concussion?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it might depend on who you ask. Certainly, I didn't say this, but brain trauma of any sort is also a risk factor for future cognitive decline and dementia. It seems to, obviously, the more concussions you've had, the more risk you're going to accumulate. Um, yeah, to be honest, I mean, I don't know, you know, some people would say not, that you may recover in the moment and you may get back to normal functioning, but if it does then present you with a future risk of those neurons dying sooner, which could lead to cognitive decline and dementia, then one could argue that you haven't really recovered. So I guess, it might depend on what we mean by recover. Can we recover in the moment, get on with our life? Probably from a mild concussion, but maybe the lasting effects don't actually show themselves until later life. And so in that regard, we didn't really recover. But yeah, trying to keep the brain healthy. I mean, I guess, I kind of take that for granted, but maybe not. But, wearing a helmet, even to cycle, I mean, it's really, really important. It's obviously the law. But, beyond that, trying to prevent head injury of any type is definitely, definitely important.
Yeah, and that kind of segues into Marilyn Harris Hart's question, which is, is hearing loss a risk factor because it can lead to social isolation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from what I can tell, because this was news to me when I kind of heard it, and then I thought, oh my God, I better go get my hearing checked because I knew it wasn't good. And I mean, so what the literature says is they're not sure yet. That's one possibility. It could also be that the processes that are leading to the hearing loss maybe somehow are due to the same thing that's causing the cognitive decline. Do you know what I mean? Maybe there's an increase in inflammation that's causing both. So they're just not sure yet, because this is a relatively new finding. The research has just not been done yet to that extent. I can tell you just from personal experience that, I struggled for a few years before I finally accepted I needed to do something. And, I can see how it could lead to social isolation, because if you can't participate, in a conversation, you tend to, start to back away from it, right? And I think, I mean, my hearing loss is not to the point where I can't hear without my hearing aids, but there are people that would be in that way. And I just, it really, tugs at my heartstrings when I see anyone like that, because I can just see that you can't fully engage in a social situation, right? And so I think over time you would start to pull back, and it could lead to isolation. Yeah, and that is one of the proposed means by which it it is a risk factor, but stay tuned. I'm sure in a few years they'll do more studies, but they're challenging to do. A lot of people don't admit or don't want to acknowledge it. So the subject pool's kind of small. I'll put myself out there as some sort of guinea pig or something for, but yeah, hopefully they'll figure more out about it. Yeah.
So another question, is there an association between substance abuse and cognitive decline?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I didn't really touch on it, but obviously everything in moderation. I mean, substance abuse over long periods of time, which is usually how it goes, does lead to, cell death in various parts of the brain. So there, and the thing is, it's just like the concussions, you might kind of get through those things when you've got tons of reserve in your 20s, 30s, 40s even. But once you start to depend on that reserve, then you're going to start to see the problems. Yeah, definitely, it's an unfortunate, it would be a risk factor as well for because it basically compromises brain structure and function. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I want to say on behalf of the Mahone Bay Center, thank you very, very much. Not only for your talk, but for your patience as we try and figure out this new platform. I know we've had a few people say that your video has frozen a couple of times or whatever for them.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh, that's too bad. I'm sorry. It didn't happen for me.
No. And it only happened a couple of times for me. So I'm hoping that when we send out the link for the video, if they can go back and take a quick peek.
Yeah.
We'll send out the link for the video pretty much
Great.
as soon as I can figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
That's on my list of things to learn. And I also just want to throw out the Mahone Bay Center would be happy to host your yoga class.
Oh.
You're ready. Don't forget about us at the venue. So thanks everyone for your patience and your attendance, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next center talks online whenever we get that up and running. So
all right, well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me and being my first webinar. If anyone has any further questions, or you can contact me. I'm happy to chat, and even in person when it's possible.
awesome.
All right, thanks a lot, Lynn. It's been great.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Take care.